The Aurora movie theater trial officially came to a close this week as Judge Carlos Samore sentenced the defendant to the maximum length of time possible, over 3,000 years, in addition to 12 consecutive life sentences. Meanwhile, Dexter Lewis was given a life sentence by a Denver jury after being found guilty of first-degree murder of 5 people at Pharaoh's Bar and Grill. Patty, it was pretty amazing to see these two big cases. Now, obviously, the Aurora movie theater trial was huge, almost international profile. The Pharaoh's Bar and Grill trial, not nearly as high profile, but death penalty possibles in both going to life sentences. Take your pick of the myriad of issues we can talk about.
Well, first of all, kudos to Judge Samore, who held a great trial, very calm, a tough trial. Went speedier than most people thought it would. It went more smoothly than most people thought it would. It was never going to be fun because the stories are so horrific. And then he put on that incredible capper to these months, these years since the shooting 3 years ago, when he said, "Get the defendant out of my courtroom." An amazing statement that really encapsulated what everyone says. Get this guy, lock him up, and we never want to see him or hear from him again. I mean, that's how we all feel about James Holmes at this point. I think we also are about ready to hear a lot about the death penalty. If you can't sentence James Holmes to death for that horrific tragedy, if you can't, Dexter Lewis, yes, he had a horrible childhood, but still, look at that crime. If he's not going to be sentenced to death, then is anyone in Colorado ever going to be sentenced to death? People say they want the death penalty, but when push comes to shove and there are 12 jurors in a room, they are never going to be unanimous in Colorado on that issue. And it's time to just say life in jail is going to be enough.
David, I mean, of course, with your legal background, I'll lean to you to answer something like this. The death penalty may not be a realistic, actual final punishment for a lot of cases. Obviously, it hasn't been for quite some time. But does it need to be there so it can still be part of a negotiation for lawyers to get other deals? Being totally unfamiliar with that side of things, I wanted to throw that to you.
Well, besides that, we had the most recent capital verdict handed down by a jury in Colorado was in 2006. It's not ancient history. And the Chuck E. Cheese murderer would be dead and executed in this state by the operation of our death penalty, if not for Governor John Hickenlooper deciding to spare his life. So we have a functional death penalty system which can sometimes be obstructed. We don't have to have, by the Constitution, a system that says in phase 3, when the jury makes its own judgment, that has to be a unanimous decision. The conversation we can have about the death penalty in Colorado can include changing that. But our current system is for the community to decide, those 12, and I'm glad that the prosecutors in both cases went through the process and let the community decide. The Greek play Antigone and the multicultural myth of something called the Grateful Dead, where the band got its name from, is about proper respect and burial for the dead. And so besides the cathartic process for the families of the victims and their ability to testify and talk about how it's affected them, this was also respectful to the actual victim, the murder victims, to have the process come out, to have the jury reject the notion that James Holmes was insane and therefore excused and not criminally culpable, to say that there were aggravating factors and no mitigating factors on his side. All that was properly respectful to the victims, and that's the process we have, and we should keep that process intact.
Natasha, we've heard from reporters, our own commentators, I've said it myself, we've heard from politicians, that a conversation about the death penalty needs to happen. We need to talk about it here in Colorado. I just don't know if anyone really wants to lead it. Do you think anyone out there, politician, religious leader, anyone wants to lead the conversation?
Well, I think politicians don't want to because it's too much of a hot topic for them. It's a no-win situation for them. Faith leaders, yeah, that would be a good starting point. But on an individual level, this is something we should be having a discussion about with our friends and our family in our houses. Well, I do think politically it is a hot potato. I would love for this to go in front of the Colorado voters. I think we're at that point. I don't want to see what kind of crime would warrant a death sentence in Colorado. If these two cases, horrific crimes, don't warrant it, we don't need to see that. But I do think Colorado has to have a question outside of some of the emotionalness of the awfulness of those crimes to say, what do we really want to do? Is this effective? Is it actually going to be something that takes place in 15 or 20 years after all the appeals are done? Is it something that we're going to still have in 15 or 20 years? Is it something that we need to change? And that should be in front of the voters so that we're forced to have the conversation.
Jessica, you're our other attorney at the table. Do you think having the death penalty is a needed negotiation point for lawyers in these kind of capital cases?
Well, it's interesting. I come here from a personal point. I live very close to Farrow's, where the murder was, in Dexter's case. I could hear the sirens for that. In addition, I also could hear the flight for life and all of the helicopters hovering from the Aurora massacre. So that's 5 miles from my house. In addition, my first day as a journalist was for Gannett, and I was in Terre Haute, Indiana, when they executed Timothy McVeigh. So I feel like I've sort of had these baby steps, and all I can say is that jurors, supposedly, according to DA George Brockler, believe 2 and 3 of them believe in the death penalty. But you get them in the box, and they will not agree. And that is part of this process. And there's something called the Colorado method, and that is the process of educating jurors about the death penalty. And I don't think, based on what we have seen in recent years, based on the different demographics, a black guy in Denver, a white guy in Arapahoe County, we are not going to see a jury that's going to go for this. What I predict is that the death penalty groups and all the coalitions are going to get smart. They're going to get somebody like Rhonda Fields or another survivor we saw in the last case, the death penalty in Arapahoe County. That was overturned because of a father coming out and saying, spare the life of my son's killer. We're going to see people like that, and that is going to be who leads this movement away from the death penalty. To Dave's point, it's cathartic. I'm glad that we have this space for victims, but we can't afford this. How many millions of dollars were spent in Arapahoe County? And I'm in that courthouse day in, day out as part of my legal practice. We don't have the money for this. And it's about effectively and respectfully treating the victims and moving them forward to the next chapter of their lives. Let's use that money.